Welcome to Enform's info session video on Element D of the COR Audit Protocol. Training. Element D is divided into two topics, health and safety orientation and job-specific training. In order to fully understand these topics, you need to know both the overlap and the differences between an initial health and safety orientation, a site-specific orientation, job qualifications, training, and competency. Let's start with orientation. When you start working for a company, they typically give you an orientation. In Canada, there are legal requirements that certain health and safety topics will be covered. The COR audit is looking for 8 elements to be a part of a company's standard orientation for new workers. Health and safety policies and procedures, health and safety roles and responsibilities, site-specific hazards and controls, WMIS information, applicable regulatory requirements like OHS legislation, WCB or NSC, discipline enforcement policies, emergency response procedures, and hazard reporting. So companies need some way of proving these are covered in their new worker orientation and some way of tracking that employees are put through the orientation. And the audit is concerned that this orientation happens on the first day, although there is some flexibility for companies that run more extensive multi-day orientations. You'll see that the third element in that list of orientation topics is site-specific hazards and controls. That brings us to the next concept, site-specific orientation. A site-specific orientation is when an employee who is new to a particular worksite is provided information on the unique hazards of that site. They should also be informed of the controls or procedures that are required as a result of these hazards. At a minimum, they need to know how to report hazards and what the emergency response procedures are on that worksite. When an employee will only ever work on a single worksite, this would be captured in that initial health and safety orientation. However, in the oil and gas industry, many workers work on more than one site, or a company may have contract workers or visitors who arrive on their work sites. In each of these cases, a site-specific orientation needs to be provided. The audit protocol also considers those scenarios where one company's workers are going to another company's work sites. In this case, the responsibility for site-specific orientation falls to the company controlling work on that site. However, the contracting company sending workers to that site needs to ensure and track that their people have received the necessary site-specific orientation. Okay, that's day 1 on the new job, or day 1 on the new worksite. But Element D is also concerned with what happens before day 1, and of course, what happens after day 1. This is where job qualifications, training, and competency assessment come in. And here, things can get a bit confusing, but let's keep it simple. Qualifications are what a worker needs even before you hire them to do the job. Training is the instruction you will provide the worker to make sure they can do the job once you have hired them. Competency assessment is how you will ensure that worker is doing their job to the standard required, typically after they have been trained to do it. Let's unpack each of these a bit. Qualifications are the minimum requirements to do a job. For a health and safety audit, we are most interested in qualifications that are required by law or are essential for a new hire to do their job safely. For example, if you're hiring a company accountant, you may require certified general accountant credentials. That's good business practice, but lies outside the concern of the health and safety audit. However, if you're hiring someone as an oil field hauler, driving qualifications would include a Class 1 driver's license. If you are hiring a supervisor for a hazardous operation, you would likely have both formal training requirements as well as a requirement to have a certain number of years of experience. In Element D, the audit is asking if the qualifications for positions have been defined, and it asks if the company makes sure that individuals hired actually meet the minimum specified qualifications. All right, so what is the difference between qualifications or being qualified and competencies or being competent? In a nutshell, qualifications are the minimum you need before you're even allowed to begin working your job. Competencies are the skills, knowledge, and abilities you need to do the job to a certain standard. And how do you move from meeting basic qualifications to being competent in a job? That's where training and experience come in. For many companies, training really begins with orientation, but let's leave that to one side to avoid confusion. Job-specific training falls into two basic categories: formal training and on-the-job or informal training. Formal training comes in a lot of varieties: third-party classroom training like H2S Alive, or perhaps a WMIS training session or an online video your company has produced. Informal or on-the-job training is when an experienced worker or supervisor explains or walks someone through their tasks on the worksite itself. It's a lot easier to track formal training, but there should be some way to document informal training as well, especially in those cases where work procedures are safety critical. A record of what was taught, who taught it, and when are essential to ensuring all workers receive their necessary on-the-job training. And from a health and safety standpoint, job-specific training for employees should address at least two items: any job-specific hazards and any applicable work procedures or practices required to do the job safely. So, for instance, if PPE is required for a job, there should be PPE training. From simple lockout procedures to advanced well-controlled procedures, training to do the job correctly and therefore safely needs to be identified and tracked. One of the more common ways of tracking training is through some type of training matrix, where you list positions or tasks and then cross-reference that to a variety of training requirements. You can then track individual workers in those positions and tasks to see where any training gaps might exist. Now, if a worker has met minimum qualifications and they have been trained for their specific job and have some experience in their job, are they competent? What you need to find out is whether or not they have the skills, knowledge, and abilities to do the job to a certain standard. We call these competencies. In a few cases, there are set industry standards for competencies in particular roles or positions. But in most cases, companies need to define what counts as competent. They need to list the types of skills, knowledge, and abilities they expect from various positions or someone doing a particular task or different levels within a role. There is flexibility in how competency programs are set up, but from a safety audit standpoint, your prime concern is with those competencies that have an impact on health and safety outcomes. Being a competent forklift operator, for example, is safety critical, while an ability to program the company financial dashboard may not be, although both of these may appear in a company's competency tracking system. Now, there is no point in defining competencies if you are not measuring them. Competency assessment is where workers are observed or measured in some way to see if, with all their qualifications, training, and experience, they have arrived at a point where they can demonstrate they're competent. That is, they're up to doing the job to a particular standard. So to recap on qualifications, training, and competency, for each we need to see that it's defined and it's confirmed and recorded for each worker. For qualifications, what do they need to have before they start work? Does the company make sure they have it? For training, what formal or informal training is required to do a job properly and safely? Is the company ensuring all of the training is completed? And for competency, what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities a worker in a certain position needs to perform to a particular level? Is someone observing and confirming these competencies are there? In its most simplistic form, the pathway for a new worker looks like this. First, the company sets out minimum qualifications to do a job. Second, a new worker meets those qualifications, and the company records evidence that they made sure of that. Third, the new worker gets orientation that includes critical health and safety information. Fourth, the new worker will receive additional site-specific orientations when they move between different work sites. Fifth, the new worker will receive formal and informal training specific to the job they're expected to do, and it must cover any job hazards and any procedures designed to control those hazards. And finally, the new worker will be measured or assessed in some way to make sure they now have the skills, knowledge, and abilities that their job demands. Of course, things are rarely that straightforward. Workers progress, take new positions, change their job descriptions, move on or move in from another company, and from both an HR and health and safety perspective, you want ongoing growth in your people. The competency cycle diagram is one way we can picture what we're trying to accomplish through our qualification, orientation training, and competency assessment systems. But remember the safety maxim. Only what gets measured gets done. In Element D, the audit is ensuring that companies hire, train, and assess workers in such a way they do the job right, which also means doing it safely. Thank you for watching. Check back for more info session videos on other core-related topics.